The sledgehammer froze mid-swing as sirens wailed down Maple Street. Marcus watched 3 squad cars screech into his driveway, their red and blue lights painting his half-demolished pool deck in chaotic colors. Behind the fence, Karen Whitmore stood with her arms crossed, pointing directly at him with the same finger she'd used to dial 911. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that buried beneath the concrete they thought he was improperly deconstructing lay the evidence. That would destroy her perfect suburban facade forever. 24 hours earlier, Marcus had been just another neighbor. Now, with that sledgehammer in his hands and the truth literally surfacing beneath his feet, he was about to become the man who brought down the most. The first crack appeared at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would reshape everything Marcus Chen thought he knew about his quiet suburban neighborhood. He stood in his backyard, coffee mug steaming in the crisp October air, staring at the concrete monstrosity that had been selling point number 3 when he'd bought the house 18 months ago. In-ground pool with premium deck finishing. The realtor had called it. What she hadn't mentioned was that the previous owner had apparently mixed the concrete with pure spite and reinforced it with sheer stubbornness. Marcus took another sip of coffee and hefted the sledgehammer. Day 4 of what was supposed to be a simple weekend project. His back ached, his hands were raw despite the work gloves, and he'd barely made a dent in the massive concrete slab that surrounded the pool, but today felt different. Today, something was going to give. The first swing sent vibrations up his arms. The second drew a hairline fracture across the surface. The third, "Excuse me," Marcus spun around, sledgehammer still raised, to find Karen Whitmore standing at the fence that separated their properties. Even at 7 in the morning, she looked like she'd stepped out of a home and garden magazine. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and her voice carried that particular tone that suggested she'd been practicing this conversation in her mirror. Yes, Marcus lowered the sledgehammer, already knowing this wasn't going to be a neighborly chat about borrowing sugar. "Do you have permits for this? Destruction?" Karen gestured toward his pool area with obvious disdain. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. In the 18 months he'd lived here, Karen had called the city about his grass being 2 inches too high, complained to the HOA about his car being parked improperly in his own driveway, and somehow convinced the Postal Service that his mail was being delivered to the wrong address, his correct address, for 3 weeks running. "It's my property, Karen. I'm removing a pool deck." Improperly, she added, as if the word carried legal weight, "There are regulations about concrete removal, Marcus, environmental concerns, noise ordinances. I've done my research." Of course, she had. Karen Whitmore didn't do anything without research. She was the president of the HOA, the head of the Neighborhood Watch, and the self-appointed guardian of property values on Maple Street. Her research usually ended with someone getting fined, cited, or publicly humiliated at the monthly HOA meetings. "I checked with the city," Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice level. "No permits required for removing non-structural concrete on private property under 12 inches thick." Karen's eyes narrowed. "And how do you know it's under 12 inches? Marcus gestured toward the obvious answer. "Because I've been hitting it with a sledgehammer for 4 days and haven't broken through yet." Exactly my point. Karen pulled out her phone, a move that, in Marcus's experience, never ended well for anyone. Improper assessment, improper tools, improper technique. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior that brings down property values for everyone. Property values. Marcus set down the sledgehammer and walked closer to the fence. "Karen, it's a pool deck. I'm removing it because the pool company needs access to pull out the liner and fill in the hole. It's all being done professionally by you, with a sledgehammer. The pool company quoted me $8,000 to remove the deck. I can do it myself for the cost of tool rental and a dumpster." Karen's expression shifted from annoyed to something approaching predatory. "And when you damage city water lines, or hit electrical conduits, or when chunks of concrete fly into my prize-winning rose garden," she gestured toward the elaborate garden bed that ran along her side of the fence. "Who pays for that, Marcus?" Marcus followed her gaze to the roses. They were beautiful, he had to admit. Karen had spent 3 years and probably tens of thousands of dollars creating what looked like something from a professional landscaping magazine. The HOA newsletter featured them regularly, and Marcus had overheard more than one neighbor mention That Karen's garden was the reason their street had won the Most Beautiful Block Award 2 years running. "I'm being careful," Marcus said. "I've got tarps up, and I'm working in small sections." "Oh, you're being careful." Karen's voice dripped with sarcasm, like you were being careful when you painted your front door without HOA approval. Or when you installed that security camera without checking sightline regulations. Marcus felt heat rising in his chest. The door had been painted the exact same color. He'd matched the paint chip to the existing finish. The security camera pointed at his own driveway and had been installed after someone had been keying cars in the neighborhood. But Karen had found violations anyway. She always found violations. "Look, I'm not doing anything wrong here. I'm improving my property, increasing its value, and doing it safely." Karen smiled, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd learned to fear that smile. "We'll see about that," she said, already dialing. "City code enforcement. Yes, I'd like to report unsafe demolition practices on Maple Street." Marcus watched her walk away, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly as she explained the dangerous situation unfolding in her neighborhood. Through her kitchen window, he could see her husband Dave sitting at the breakfast table, reading his newspaper with the studied concentration of a man who'd learned not to get involved in his wife's crusades. Marcus picked up the sledgehammer again. Code enforcement would show up, find nothing wrong, and leave. It would waste his morning, but it wouldn't stop his project. Karen knew this, so why did she look so satisfied? He raised the sledgehammer and brought it down hard. This time, something different happened. Instead of the usual solid thunk, he heard a hollow crack. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the surface, and when he knelt down to examine it, he realized the concrete was breaking away in chunks. Marcus worked the edge of one piece with a pry bar, and it came away cleanly, revealing something. Underneath that made him stop breathing. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't the sand base he'd expected. It was another layer of concrete, newer, smoother, and definitely not part of the original pool deck. This concrete had been poured over something that left regular geometric impressions in the surface. Something that looked disturbingly like it had been shaped around objects that were no longer there, or maybe still were. Marcus glanced toward Karen's house. She was still on the phone, pacing in her kitchen, but her attention had shifted. She was watching him through the window now, and her animated gesturing had stopped. Even from 50 feet away, Marcus could see that her expression had changed. She was no longer annoyed. She looked afraid. Marcus turned back to the concrete and pried away another chunk. The impression beneath was clearer, now rectangular, about the size of a small suitcase, with rounded corners and what looked like handle indentations on the sides. Next to it, another impression, and another. His hands trembling slightly, Marcus reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam revealed a systematic pattern of rectangular impressions, each one carefully spaced, each one filled with that newer concrete. Someone had buried a lot of rectangular objects under this pool deck, then poured concrete over them to hide. The evidence? The question was, what was in those suitcase-shaped impressions? And why had Karen Whitmore gone pale as death the moment he'd started uncovering them? Marcus looked up to find Karen standing at her fence again, no longer on the phone. Her perfect composure had cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. "Marcus?" she called out, her voice artificially bright. "I've been thinking, maybe I was too hasty. The city doesn't need to get involved. It's your property, after all." But Marcus was already pulling away another chunk of concrete, revealing more of the hidden layer beneath. Whatever was down there, Karen very badly didn't want him to find it, which meant he absolutely had to keep digging. The sledgehammer felt lighter in his hands now, purpose driving every swing. Each crack in the concrete was another step toward uncovering whatever secret Karen Whitmore had been so desperate to keep buried. Behind him, he heard Karen's gate slam shut and her hurried footsteps on the sidewalk. By the time he looked up, she was already at his front door, finger pressed urgently against the doorbell. This time, she wasn't calling the city. This time, she was calling the police. The doorbell's urgent chiming cut through the morning air like an alarm. Marcus ignored it, bringing the sledgehammer down again. Another chunk of surface concrete cracked away, exposing more of the hidden layer beneath, and definitely something Karen Whitmore was desperate to keep buried. The doorbell rang again. Then again, Marcus, "Please, we need to talk." Karen's voice had lost all its usual authority. Gone was the imperious tone she used at HOA meetings. This was raw panic, barely contained. Marcus set down the sledgehammer and walked to his front door. Through the peephole, he could see Karen pacing on his porch, cell phone clutched in one hand, her other hand tugging at her perfect hair. Her makeup was still flawless, but her composure had completely shattered. He opened the door. "What can I do for you, Karen? You need to stop." The words tumbled out in a rush. "The demolition. It's dangerous. I've been researching, and there could be utilities down there. Gas lines. You could cause an explosion." Marcus studied her face. In 18 months of dealing with Karen's complaints, he'd never seen her look genuinely frightened. Annoyed, yes. Self-righteous, absolutely. But not scared. Not like this. "I called the utility marking service before I started," Marcus said calmly. "Everything's been marked." Over his shoulder toward the backyard, where the evidence of his morning's work was clearly visible. But what about environmental concerns? Old concrete can contain asbestos. Lead, you're creating a public health hazard. The house was built in 1998. Karen, no asbestos in concrete from 1998. You don't know that for certain. Her voice was getting shriller. "You're not an expert. You're just swinging a sledgehammer around like some kind of barbarian." Marcus almost smiled. Karen Whitmore calling someone a barbarian. The woman who'd once called, "Yesterday you wanted me fined for improper demolition. Today you're worried about my safety." Her phone buzzed. "I'm asking nicely. Can't you just ... hire professionals? The HOA has a discretionary fund for neighborhood improvements." Now Marcus was genuinely shocked. Karen Whitmore offering to pay for something she'd been trying to stop. Whatever was under that concrete, it was worth a lot more to her than the few $1,000s this would cost. "I've rented the equipment, scheduled the dumpster. I'm not stopping now." Karen's phone buzzed again. This time, when she read the message, she closed her eyes as if in pain. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, she whispered. "Who will, Karen?" "I told them you were conducting unsafe demolition practices, creating a public nuisance, possibly violating city ordinances." Marcus felt anger surge in his chest. "You called the cops. On me? For removing concrete from my own property? I had to." The words burst out of her. "You don't understand what you're doing. You don't understand what you might find." There it was. The truth finally breaking through her panic. Marcus stepped closer. "What am I going to find, Karen?" She backed away from him, shaking her head. "Nothing. The police will make you stop, will they? I'm not breaking any laws. You will be. I'll make sure you are." Her voice was hardening again, desperation transforming back into the familiar authoritarianism. This wasn't about ordinances or regulations. This was about whatever was buried under his pool deck, whatever had left those. "How long have you lived here, Karen?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What? How long have you lived in this house, on this street? Who owned my house before me?" Karen's jaw tightened. "What about them? How long did they live here?" "I don't see how that's relevant to just answer the question." Karen glanced at her phone again, as if checking the time. 5 years. They lived there for 5 years, and before them, Marcus, the police will be here soon. "You should..." When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The Malones. And how long did they live there?" 2 years. That's a lot of turnover for one house. 3 families in 7 years. Marcus leaned against his doorframe, watching her carefully. "What happened to the Malones?" "They moved." "Where?" "I don't know. People move, Marcus." Her voice said the Malones' departure was anything but ordinary. "When did they move?" Karen's phone buzzed, as if the interruption had saved her from having to answer. "The police are 2 minutes out." "Marcus, please, for both our sakes, stop digging." "For both our sakes," Marcus straightened. "Karen, what exactly do you think I'm going to find under there?" Quickly back toward her house, phone pressed to her ear again. Marcus could hear fragments of her conversation. "Yes. No, he won't listen. I don't know how much he's just get here quickly." Marcus closed his front door and walked back to his backyard. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the broken concrete. They were uniform in size, evenly spaced, and deep enough to suggest whatever had been buried here was substantial. He pulled out his phone and took pictures. Close-ups of the impressions, wide shots showing the pattern, detail shots of the concrete. The sound of car door slamming echoed from the front of the house. Heavy footsteps on the walkway. The doorbell again, this time with an authoritative double ring that could only mean one thing. Marcus walked to his front door and opened it to find two police officers standing on his porch. The older one, a Hispanic man with graying temples and tired eyes, held a small notebook. The younger one, a blonde woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of the academy, had her hand resting casually on her radio. "Mr. Chen." The older officer checked his notebook. "I'm Officer Ramirez. This is Officer Walsh. We received a complaint about unsafe demolition practices on your property. From Karen Whitmore, I assume." Officer Ramirez nodded. "She's concerned about potential safety violations, environmental hazards. Says you're using improper tools and techniques." Marcus glanced past the officers to where Karen stood in her front yard, arms crossed, watching the interaction with obvious satisfaction. Her panic from 20 minutes ago had been replaced by the smug confidence of someone who believed she'd just won. "Officers, I'm removing a concrete pool deck from my own property. I've checked all relevant regulations, called for utility marking, and I'm using appropriate safety equipment. I'm not violating any laws." Officer Walsh spoke for the first time. "Mind if we take a look at what you're doing?" "Not at all." Marcus led them round to his backyard. Officer Ramirez made notes, while Officer Walsh took pictures with her phone. "Looks pretty standard to me," Officer Walsh said to her partner. "Work gloves, proper tool usage, properties clearly marked for utilities." Officer Ramirez nodded, then noticed the exposed layer of concrete beneath the surface. "What's that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Marcus knelt down and pointed to the rectangular impressions. "The previous owners apparently poured concrete over something. I'm trying to remove it all so the pool company can access the underlying structure." Officer Walsh crouched down for a closer look. "Those are weird shapes, almost like ... like suitcases," Marcus finished. Both officers exchanged a glance. "Chen, how long have you lived here? 18 months? And you bought it from the Hendersons?" "That's right." Officer Ramirez was quiet for a moment, studying the impressions in the concrete. When he looked up, his expression had changed from routine boredom to something more alert. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you to stop your demolition work for now." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Why? I'm not breaking any laws." "No, you're not. But we may need to treat this as a potential crime scene." From the front yard came the sound of Karen Whitmore's voice, sharp and panicked. "Crime scene? What do you mean, crime scene?" Officer Walsh stood up and walked toward the fence. "But this is my property. I have a right to know what's happening." "Ma'am, please step back." Marcus watched Karen retreat toward her house, her satisfaction replaced once again by that raw fear he'd seen earlier. She knew Psalm. Within 30 minutes, Marcus's quiet suburban backyard had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the October breeze, stretching from his back porch to the fence line. 2 additional patrol cars had arrived, followed by an unmarked sedan and a white van with county forensics stenciled on the side. Marcus sat on his back steps, watching teams of technicians photograph, measure, and carefully excavate the concrete he'd been attacking with a sledgehammer. Hours earlier, the irony wasn't lost on him if he'd hired professionals like Karen had suggested. None of this would have been discovered. Detective Sarah Liu approached him, a small woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She'd been questioning him for the past 20 minutes, her tone professional but increasingly intense. "Let's go over this again, Mr. Chen. You've lived here 18 months. You bought the house from Janet and Robert Henderson. You've never met the previous owners before them." "That's correct. And you decided to remove the pool deck because the pool company said they needed access to remove the liner and fill. In the pool, they quoted me $8,000 to remove the deck, so I decided to do it myself." Detective Liu made notes in a small leather notebook. "Had you noticed anything unusual about the concrete before you started? Any irregularities?" Marcus shook his head. "Maybe a little thicker than usual, but I assumed the previous owners wanted something durable." "And when you broke through the surface layer, you immediately noticed the impressions?" "Not immediately. At first, I thought it was just a different pour method. But when I started clearing away chunks, The pattern became obvious. Detective Liu glanced toward the excavation site, where two forensic technicians were using small brushes and tools to carefully expose more of the underlying concrete. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you directly. Have you ever heard any rumors about this house, about the previous owners? Anything that might explain what we're finding here?" Marcus thought about his interactions with the neighbors over the past 18 months. Friendly waves, casual conversations about weather and property maintenance, but nothing substantial. Nothing about the house's history. No, nothing. Everyone's been ... normal, except for Karen's complaints about HOA violations. Detective Liu's attention sharpened. "Tell me about Mrs. Whitmore's complaints." "The usual neighbor stuff. Grass too long, car parked wrong, unpermitted paint color. She's very involved in the HOA, very concerned about property values. And this morning, her reaction when you started breaking through the surface layer." Marcus replayed the morning's events in his mind. Karen's initial complaint about permits, her phone call to code enforcement, then her sudden reversal and desperate attempts to get him to stop digging, find a violation, call the authorities. But when I started uncovering the deeper layer, she got scared, really scared. She offered to pay for professional removal. Detective Liu's eyebrows rose. She offered to pay through the HOA discretionary fund. She said it was for neighborhood improvements. That's ... unusual. A forensic technician approached them, holding a small digital camera. "Detective Liu, you need to see this." They walked over to the excavation site. The technicians had exposed nearly half of the underlying concrete, revealing a precise grid of rectangular impressions. Each one was approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, roughly the size of a large suitcase or a small trunk. 12 confirmed depressions so far, the technician said. All uniform size, evenly spaced, approximately 18 inches deep. The concrete appears to have been poured in sections over a period of time. Different curing patterns suggest multiple pours. Detective Liu knelt down and examined one of the impressions more closely. "How old would you estimate this underlying layer?" "Hard to say exactly without core samples, but based on the concrete composition and weathering patterns, I'd guess 8 to 10 years. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. 8 to 10 years. That would put the timing right around when the Malones lived here. "We've got something." They gathered around a depression near the fence line. This one was different. The concrete hadn't completely filled the space, leaving a small gap along one edge. The technician had inserted a thin probe into the gap and was now carefully widening it with precision tools. "There's definitely something down there," the technician said. "Something that's not dirt or sand." Detective Liu turned to Marcus. "Mr. Chen, I need you to step back, please." Marcus retreated to his porch, but he could still see everything. The technicians worked with painstaking care, gradually exposing whatever lay beneath the concrete. Other officers had spread out across the backyard, examining the area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment. A commotion from the front yard drew Marcus's attention. Through his house, he could see more vehicles arriving, news vans, additional police cars, what looked like the county coroner's van. Word was spreading. Officer Ramirez approached the porch. "Mr. Chen, we're going to need you to find somewhere else to stay tonight. This is now an active crime scene, and we'll be working through the evening." "How long will this take?" "Could be days, maybe weeks, depending on what we find." Marcus nodded, already mentally preparing to call his brother about staying in his guest room. But his attention was drawn to movement in Karen's backyard. She was pacing along her fence line, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing frantically. Even from 50 yards away, he could see she was upset. "Officer Ramirez," Marcus said, "how well do you know the neighborhood history? The previous owners of this house?" Ramirez pulled out his notebook and flipped through several pages. "We've been making calls. The Hendersons bought the house from Thomas and Patricia Malone in August 2015. The Malones bought it new in 2013. What happened to the Malones? That's what we're trying to figure out. They apparently left very suddenly. Neighbors remembered them being here one day and gone the next. House went up for sale immediately, sold below market value to the Hendersons." Marcus watched Karen through his kitchen window. Did anyone report them missing? No missing persons report was ever filed. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. People move, sometimes in a hurry. job transfers, family emergencies, financial problems. A shout from the backyard interrupted their conversation. Detective Lou was waving them over, her expression grim. "We've got confirmation," she said when they reached the excavation site. "There's definitely something buried in this depression, something organic." Marcus felt his knees go weak. Organic. The probe detected fabric, possibly leather, and ... Detective Liu paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are traces of decomposition." The backyard fell silent except for the sound of equipment and the distant hum of news helicopters that had begun circling overhead. Marcus stared down at the innocent-looking rectangular depression, realizing that his simple home improvement project had just uncovered what might be multiple graves. "Mr. Chen," Detective Liu said, "I need to ask you again. Are you absolutely certain you've never heard anything about the Malones? Any rumors? Any stories? Anything at all?" Marcus shook his head, but something was nagging at him. A memory from months ago, a casual conversation with ... "Wait," he said suddenly. "There was something. Last spring, I was talking to Mr. Davidson from 3 houses down. We were discussing property values, and he mentioned that houses on this block sometimes had trouble selling. He said there had been some unpleasantness a few years back, but he didn't give details." Detective Liu made a note. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Davidson." A uniformed officer approached them. "Detective Mrs. Whitmore is asking to speak with you. She says she has information about the previous owners." Marcus watched Detective Liu's expression after 3 hours of careful excavation and investigation. Karen Whitmore suddenly had information to share, the same Karen who had spent the morning desperately trying to stop this discovery from happening. "Where is she? Front yard?" She seems agitated. Detective Liu looked back at the excavation site, where technicians were preparing to expand their work to the remaining depressions. "Continue the excavation. Document everything. I want to know what's in every single one of these graves." Graves. She'd said it out loud now. This wasn't speculation anymore. Marcus followed Detective Liu toward the front yard, his mind racing. Karen had information about the Malones, information she'd kept secret for years while living 50 feet away from what appeared to be their burial site. As they rounded the corner of the house, Marcus could see Karen standing beside the yellow tape, her perfect composure finally and completely shattered. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her hands were shaking as she clutched her phone. When she saw Detective Liu approaching, she stepped forward eagerly. "Detective, I need to tell you something about the Malones, about what really happened to them." Detective Liu stopped just outside the tape line. "I'm listening, Mrs. Whitmore." Karen glanced around at the growing crowd of neighbors, news crews, and police officers. Detective Liu ducked under the yellow tape and approached Karen, her notepad ready. The gathered crowd of neighbors and news crews pressed closer, straining to hear. Marcus found himself holding his breath. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to be very careful about what you're about to say. Are you confessing to knowledge of a crime?" Karen's laugh was sharp and bitter. Detective, I've been living with this knowledge for 8 years. 8 years of watching families move into that house, wondering if they'd ever discover what I discovered. 8 years of sleepless nights, of jumping every time someone started a home improvement project." She gestured toward Marcus's backyard, where the forensic team continued their careful excavation. "I tried to stop him. God help me. I tried everything I could think of to stop him from digging." "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Liu said firmly, "I need you to tell me exactly what you know about Thomas and Patricia Malone." Karen closed her eyes, as if gathering strength for what came next. When she opened them, tears were streaming down her cheeks, carving tracks through her carefully applied makeup. They were good people, quiet, kept to themselves mostly. Tom worked in it. Patricia was a teacher. They'd been trying to have children for years. Her voice broke slightly. "Patricia used to come over to admire my roses. She wanted to start her own garden." Marcus watched Detective Liu's expression. She was being patient, letting Karen tell the story at her own pace. But there was an urgency in her posture that suggested she suspected where this was heading. "What happened to them?" "Mrs. Whitmore, Dave happened to them." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus felt the world shift around him. Dave, Karen's husband, the quiet man who read his newspaper at breakfast and never got involved in his wife's neighborhood crusades. "Your husband killed the Malones." Detective Liu's voice was carefully neutral, not just the Malones. Karen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There were others. Before we moved here, Dave has a sickness, an anger problem that goes way beyond normal rage. When he gets triggered, when he feels disrespected or challenged, he ... double quotes. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mrs. Whitmore, where is your husband now? Karen glanced toward her house, where Marcus could see Dave's silhouette in the kitchen window. He was still sitting at the breakfast table, but he was no longer reading his newspaper. He was watching the police activity in Marcus's yard with the focused attention of someone calculating his options. He's inside. He's been watching all morning, I think. I think he knows it's over. Detective Lou was already signaling to the officers around them. Marcus saw them begin moving toward Karen's house, hands resting on their weapons, speaking into their radios in urgent, clipped tones. Karen, Detective Lou said, I need you to tell me everything. How many victims? How long has this been going on? I don't know exactly how many. Dave never told me details, and I didn't want to know. But we've lived in 4 different states over the past 15 years. We always moved suddenly, always left houses behind. I thought it was his job, or financial problems, or she laughed bitterly. I made excuses. I always made excuses. Marcus felt sick. He thought about all the times he'd seen Dave Whitmore around the neighborhood. Quiet, unremarkable Dave, who helped neighbors with heavy lifting and never raised his voice. Who had been living 50 feet away from the bodies of people he'd murdered. When did you find out about the Malones, specifically? The night it happened. August 15th, 2015. I woke up around 2 a.m. and Dave wasn't in bed. I found him in the backyard with a shovel, covered in mud and concrete mix. There was a rental truck in our driveway that I'd never seen before. Detective Lou was writing rapidly. Did you see the bodies? No. They were already in the ground. But I saw him pouring concrete over the burial site, section by section, like he'd done it before. And when I asked him what he was doing, Karen's voice broke entirely. He told me to go back to bed and forget what I'd seen. He said if I ever told anyone, I'd join them. A commotion from the direction of Karen's house drew everyone's attention. Officers were at her front door, but instead of the controlled entry Marcus expected, they seemed to be regrouping, speaking urgently into their radios. Detective Lou Officer Ramirez was running toward them from the house. He's not responding. 2 commands, doors locked, curtains are drawn. Neighbor reports hearing what sounded like a single gunshot about 10 minutes ago. Karen collapsed, literally fell to her knees on the sidewalk, her hands pressed to her face. Oh God. No, he said he'd never go to prison. He said he'd rather die than let them cage him like an animal. Detective Lou was already moving, barking orders into her radio. I need SWAT, I need paramedics, and I need the coroner. Possible suicide, possible hostage situation, lock down the entire block. Marcus found himself caught between fascination and horror as the quiet suburban street transformed into a law enforcement staging area. Armored vehicles arrived, tactical teams deployed, and residents were evacuated from the surrounding houses. But Karen remained on the sidewalk, rocking back and forth, mumbling something that Marcus finally recognized as addresses. 2247 Maple Drive, Cedar Hills, Iowa. 1834 Oak Street, Riverside, California. 445 Pine Avenue, Springfield, Oregon. Detective Liu crouched down beside her. Karen, what are those addresses? The other houses? The places we lived before? Dave made me help him research the properties, find houses with big backyards, privacy fences, concrete slabs. He said it was for his workshop projects, but... She looked up at Detective Liu with haunted eyes. There are more bodies, Detective. In every place we lived, there are more bodies. Marcus felt the full scope of what they'd uncovered, hitting him like a physical blow. This wasn't about the Malones. This was about a serial killer who had been operating for over a decade. Moving from state to state, burying his victims under concrete slabs in suburban backyards. And Karen had known for 15 years she had known. Why didn't you report him? Detective Liu asked the question Marcus was thinking. Because I was afraid. Because he told me I was an accessory. Because he said I'd helped him choose the houses, helped him scout the neighborhoods. He was right. I did help him. I researched property records, HOA regulations, zoning laws. I thought I was helping him find good investments. I didn't know, but Marcus could see in her face that she had known. Maybe not the full extent, maybe not the specific details, but some part of her had known what Dave was doing, and she'd chosen to look the other way. A sharp crack echoed from inside the Whitmore house. Not a gunshot, something structural, glass breaking, or wood splintering. The tactical team was making their entry. Minutes passed. Marcus found himself holding his breath again, waiting for some signal that would indicate whether Dave Whitmore was alive or dead, whether this nightmare was ending or just beginning. Finally, Officer Ramirez emerged from the house and approached Detective Liu. His expression was grim. One victim, self-inflicted, gunshot wound, deceased, but detective ... He glanced around at the crowd of neighbors and news crews. You need to see what we found in his basement. Detective Liu turned to another officer. Get Mrs. Whitmore to the station. I want a full statement, and I want her checked by a psychiatrist. She's either a victim or an accomplice, and right now, I can't tell which. As Karen was helped to her feet and guided toward a police car, she looked back at Marcus with an expression of something that might have been gratitude. She called out, I'm sorry I tried to stop you. I was so scared of what would happen when the truth came out. But those families deserve justice. The Malones and all the others, they deserve to be found. Marcus watched the police car drive away, carrying Karen toward whatever justice or mercy awaited her. Around him, the investigation continued, expanding now beyond his backyard to include Dave Whitmore's house, his basement, and potentially crime scenes in 3 other states. His simple home improvement project had uncovered not just a burial ground, but the methodical work of a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. And somewhere in his basement, Dave Whitmore had left behind evidence that would likely reveal the full scope of his crimes, and possibly identify victims whose families had been wondering about their fate for years. Marcus looked back at his house, at the yellow tape and forensic equipment and careful excavation that continued in his backyard. Tomorrow, this story would be national news. The quiet suburb of Willowbrook Heights would be infamous. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, the Malones could finally rest in peace.